We're going to be up with Scott Adams. You can find him at www.scottadamsays.com. You can find him at Twitter at ScottAdamsSays. You can read one of his books. One of them we'll be talking about a lot tonight is Loser Think. You can also read books like Win Bigly or How to Fail at Almost Everything and Still Win Big. You may know him most famously as the great comic writer for Dilbert. I began to follow him in more detail. You can get little pearls of persuasive wisdom every night on his Periscope, where he gives them out for free for about 20, 25 minutes, 30 minutes a night. He famously forecast the Trump election correctly. I'd always been a fan of Dilbert, was a fan of his persuasive books. Not only is Loser Think an excellent way to filter out and frame out information in policy debates like this one, but also books like How to Fail at Almost Everything and Still Win Big, I gave to my son. It's a great mindset book, a way to live your life, little cues, little clues about how to improve your everyday mindset to make your life better, whether it's stacking your skills for an effective skill set or communicating with those you care about or communicating about matters of public interest. So, Scott, glad you could be with us tonight.
Thanks for having me.
What's been fascinating to me is if we took a lot of the ideas from Loser Think, I've seen a lot of indicia of that in what I think our politicians have been using as the premise for a lot of their pandemic policy response. And so that's why I wanted to explore that, at least in part, and explore in part first why some of those sort of little proverbs, little pearls of wisdom are good for understanding, putting an objective filter on looking at anybody making a decision and what their persuasive logic is, or in some cases, lack of persuasive logic is for that particular decision. In that context, you do a great job. I remember years ago seeing in one of your Periscopes, you introduced this idea even before the book, about how models, particularly models that are forecasting things long into the future, one should be fairly skeptical of. And I think you were describing it in the context of your own prior employment. And basically the goal was, just create the model so that somebody feels happy upstairs, not necessarily so that you can actually predict it. Because you point out in complex matters, multivariate matters, the ability to forecast past 6 months is going to be more like rolling dice than it's going to be like a science. Could you explain that for people a little bit?
Yeah, as you said, I used to do long-range forecast models for my job. They were financial ones, but you see the same dynamics, which is as soon as you get a few variables in there and you make a few assumptions and you iterate it for a year or two, everything goes so wildly in different directions based on small changes of assumptions that really it's the person who's making the model who engineers the result. And I saw that over and over again, because if I got the wrong result, my boss would say, well, maybe change that assumption a little bit. So in the real world, that's the way it works. Now, the thing that people don't understand is that there is no way to predict the future. If anybody could do it in any context reliably, they would be, a trillionaire. So the first thing you need to know is that it can't be done, and you can know that for sure because somebody would get rich on it. You just have to, bet on it or whatever you needed to do. So that's the first thing. The second thing is they're not intended to predict the future, and that's what everybody misunderstands. The best thing a model can do is to show you a range. If you put in the worst case scenario variables, what's the high side? And the best case, what's the low side, or vice versa? And then you say, okay, it's going to be somewhere in this giant range. But then the dumb thing happens where they say, let's take the average and we'll say it's this thing in the middle of this line. And that's where it all goes wrong, because they shouldn't do that at all, because that makes it look like they believe they can predict the future. And that's not even what the models are for. They can't do that. They shouldn't be even interpreted that way.
Exactly. And there was a second subcomponent of that I thought was really good in the book Loser Think, which is to be very wary of people doing straight line forecasting. So that where they're saying because something has been happening ABC in the past, we're going to assume it's just going to keep going like that in the future, because in the same way, the future is both multivariate and something's going to happen that you didn't forecast or sometimes couldn't, but sometimes would. Could you explain why straight line thinking is not the best, is a form of loser think?
Right. So if you just take our current situation with the COVID, look at how many news stories have broken in the last 30 days that might have been, probably they're not, what could have been a complete game changer. It's like maybe this therapeutic works. Maybe this vaccine comes in way earlier than any ever has. Maybe the ventilators, if you stopped using them, you'd get better result. Maybe there's something genetic. Maybe they've got a dog that can sniff it. I read that today. They're training dogs to sniff it out. Maybe there's a test that's instant. There's some of that coming too. So, if you were to try to tell me where will the COVID thing be in just 30 days, in 30 days, could you confidently tell me what's going to happen in 30 days? Because there's a whole bunch of human ingenuity that's not just sort of casually walking past this thing. This is the whole 7 billion people, the smartest people that we can find on the whole frickin' earth on this problem. And as you've heard some of the researchers talking, that now that they're talking to each other more efficiently than has ever happened before, some are expecting immense lasting benefits from learning how to work internationally so efficiently. So that's completely unpredictable. You take climate change, the obvious one. They say, well, if you keep polluting this way, the CO2 rises this way, the temperature rises this way. And they wouldn't say it's a straight line, but more of a predictable curve. But that too is an 80-year prediction. Are you kidding me? 80 years? Now, for people like me who understand what the model is for, it's actually fine. If you understand what it really is for, it shows you this giant range. It says, if things go the way our scientists think, we have trouble. We don't know how big, but you better start getting ready for this. But the thing that they can't model is the coronavirus happens. They can't model that somebody invents something, that Elon Musk's solar roof tiles catch on and everybody wants them. So there's just so many things that could change in 80 years. It's absurd. And then you add onto that what I call the Adams law of slow-moving disasters, which says we're really, really good at solving things when we see them coming. Coronavirus caught us a little off guard. We're dumb because we weren't as ready as we could have been, but we couldn't have really been ready for this specific one. We maybe could have generally been ready. But yeah, so it's really ridiculous to ignore human ingenuity when you're predicting 80 years in advance. I mean, I don't even know if humans will be here. We might all be cyborgs or living in a computer simulation. 80 years? That's a long time.
No doubt about it. Well, I think Elon thinks sometimes at least that maybe we already are in the simulation. And sometimes I think maybe we are too with some of the peculiarities that happen. And both you and Mike Cernovich have had fun with that upon occasion over the last year and a half. One of the other things I thought, and while some of this is basics in the sense of economics planning and the rest, but it's always astounding to me how often people miss and doing a cost-benefit analysis of any policy, particularly comparing it to alternatives. That we don't live in a world of the real versus the ideal. We live in the world of two reals. And it's amazing how people either only focus on the cost of one or only focus on the benefits of the other. Could you explain the importance of that and why it's loser think when you see someone only talking about cost of one or the benefits of the other?
Yeah, and that's the risk of letting medical professionals driving the decision, because they're sort of biased toward don't kill anybody who has a name, and so their decision is going to be, well, I don't want anybody to die that will ever have a photograph on the news that says Mary died because of your decision. So you can't trust doctors to make that kind of decision. They're going to minimize that if they're human. But will the doctors take into consideration all of the economic machinations that would cause people to die in more indirect ways? But you're never going to have a picture on the news. You're never going to say Carl died because the economy went down 7%. Even if he did, we will never know if that's why Carl died. So you certainly have to have people who are even capable of taking the expert opinions and say, all right, here are all the costs. Here are all the benefits, and you see terrible decisions being made. Let me give you the best example, the hydroxychloroquine. All right, what we know about it is that it's been used forever on other conditions, so it's relatively safe from that. We know that it might work, but it might not. I'm personally giving it a 40% chance of working, but given the enormity of the economic and other disasters and the tiny risk it's no surprise that doctors are taking it on the down low. You hear a lot of reports of, oh yeah, all the doctors are taking it. The ones that are on the front line, just to be careful.
Oh yes.
So
in fact,
you see that.
Go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah. Yeah. You see that, and you know that it has to be somebody like a Trump, a business person who's going to say, okay, the medical is part of it. And up till now, I've done exactly what you said. I did the mitigation, basically letter of the doctor's law. I've been following it. But now this isn't your decision anymore. You're just input. Right. Now it's my decision. And that's when the adults get involved. And here's the other caution. Our government is not designed for this decision, because the government, the president, should never say, well, here's my decision. I'm going to be honest with you. We're going to kill poor people to keep the old people alive, or vice versa. We're going to let the old people die. I'm going to favor the poor people. There's no way our elected government can do that. We've designed it so they can't. And I think it's going to require almost a revolution, a peaceful one, from the population to say, look, we get it. We sacrifice. We get that you don't know exactly when to go back. No expert knows exactly what's going to happen. We get that we could try something and pull back if it doesn't work, but just let us go. Like at this point, just let us take a shot at it, because you don't know more than we do at this point, right? Because we've seen the experts just giving us the worst information. I mean, just blatant lies. Masks don't work. Are you kidding me? This doesn't spread from person to person. Seriously? This is what our experts are telling us, and we're going to decide the fate of civilization on the next thing they tell us? I hope not. I hope it's somebody like Trump. Doesn't have to be him, but somebody with that skill set who says the medical is just part of the input.
Exactly. Part of that cost benefits analysis, part of that comparing alternatives. And you're right. We are put in this extraordinary position. Particularly, one of the things you mentioned in Loserthink is the risk of anecdotal thinking. So that, for example, like in particular here, all the anecdotal thinking, for the most part, weights on one side. In other words, everybody knows somebody. I know my dad's a doctor at such and such a hospital, and he's seen terrible things. And I know my grandma got. I know a young person who got this, something like that. And there isn't, well, okay, I know somebody who went and got overdosed on opiates because they were alone for too long. There's not that kind of easy anecdotal evidence. But in general, to explain why anecdotal evidence is often a sign of loserthink, because of the tendency to exaggerate its import and its consequence and whatnot.
Well, our brains are kind of limited machines in this big, complicated universe. So we can only focus on the few things we can focus on, and we have to ignore the rest. And the way your brain is wired is whatever you focus on, you irrationally think must be more important, because your brain is spending so much time on it. So anecdotes take up your brain power, and then they influence you to think, well, I only heard 2 stories, but I haven't heard any other stories. Well, I'm going to go with it, because in the real world, you don't get to do a scientific study for every decision in your life. It's not practical. You kind of say, well, Bob did this and it worked for him. I'll try it. So unfortunately, that's the best we can do sometimes. But if you have the option of a scientific study, well, then it's just crazy to look at the anecdotal and prefer it.
The other thing I thought that was really good throughout Loserthink is and having witnessed this, as a lawyer, I deal with a lot of experts. So I'll just put it this way. It doesn't tend to lead to an increased estimation of my opinion of experts. Not to discredit them, but when I know that I can basically call one expert, and if I offer this amount of money and I call that one, offer this, I can get them to conflict or contradict one another. I think you brilliantly put it in the book is you can get one expert to say the other expert's as good as a monkey pounding piano keys, which is a nice visual imagery, but it's deeply universally true, at least in my professional experience as a lawyer. And so one of the things I found unsettling throughout the public policy debate about the pandemic was a lot of people telling us, let's just defer to the experts, whomever the experts may be, whichever side they may be. Because as you know, the World Health Organization has been literally opposite sides of the same issue. And they're supposed to be the premier public health expert organization. The UK said, let's do herd immunity, and then turned around and said, let's not do herd immunity. So could you explain why deference to experts, particularly in cases of complexity, cases of novelty, is not always the best strategy and can be a sign of loserthink?
Well, you got to be very careful with it, because I would never be the person who says ignore the experts. That would be crazy. but you have to have enough experience to be able to catch it when you're not getting the right advice. So you got to be looking for their financial interest. Do they have one? You got to see if they have the right kind of talent stack to even give you a well-rounded decision, or is it very narrow like a doctor would? So you're going to go through all of those calculations in your head. But wait, what was the question? I think I rambled too far.
No, that's fine. I mean, it's a version of it. I have like a 2-compound provision. One is that just because someone is an expert doesn't mean necessarily they're an expert in this particular issue. In other words, they may be like a broad expert in epidemiology. That doesn't mean that how to assess the economic collateral consequences is right within their bandwidth.
Right. I say that about climate change. I say, yes, all the experts most of the experts seem to be on one side, but each of those experts only knows their little channel. They're kind of trusting the other experts. So it's not like there's an expert who is an expert on being an expert. I say that about stocks too. You can pick a stock professional to help you pick stocks, but how do you pick that stock professional? It's the same as picking a stock. There's no basis by which you can guess which one will do the good job. You might as well just pick stocks, which is also a bad idea. You should diversify, but get a fund. So that's what I say. And then there was a mind-boggling expert thing I heard just before I got on here, and I have to share this with you because I know it's right up your alley, if you don't mind.
Sure, absolutely.
So, of course, the big question is, people comparing the coronavirus to the regular flu and the numbers. And there was an ER doctor who made the same observation I made, and I heard Trump make on his town hall, which was, I've never known anybody who ever died of a regular flu. So how could it be that 50,000, 60,000, 80,000 are dying, and I've never even heard of it? Because have you heard of people who died of overdoses? Yes. How about my stepson? How about, their friends? How about lots of people died in car accidents? Yes. Died in, I know people who died in 9/11. I mean, I know all kinds of people died. So anyway, this ER doctor, 7 years as a doctor, said, why have I never seen anybody die of the flu, the regular flu? So he called his doctor friends and said, have any of you ever seen anybody die of the flu? And a few of them said that over their career, a few, 1 or 2. Other doctors said their entire career, they'd never seen one. And so the doctor did a little more digging, and it turns out that 50, 60, 80,000 number that they say for the regular flu is completely made up.
Basically what they do is they try to take an excess fatality assessment. It's entirely projections. It was one of the things early on that unsettled me when they were making comparisons. So as soon as they were comparing the flu to COVID, I was like, well, how precisely are they making that comparison? My view was that COVID was worse than the flu, or otherwise China wouldn't have shut down. Now, when I saw other things happen, I was concerned about our response being disproportionate and disparate, and people seeking it for objectives that did not have when they were shutting down the beaches, that did not make sense to me, especially people swimming by themselves, surfing by themselves, paddleboarding in Malibu. I've lived a long time in Malibu. The idea that they were going to chase after paddleboarders and surfers, but leave it to the skateboarders to take, they put the sand in the skateboarding park. And talking to your inventiveness, they just go and make it a dirt bike park. So God bless them. They're the last independent folks left in parts of California, I'm afraid, where we both reside for a long time. But yeah, Mike, like early on, like the flu, when they were starting to say, hey, this death rate is this death rate was this. And I had 2 issues with it. One, I was like, COVID-19 is new, so we're not really going to know its mortality rate probably for 6 months. We're going to be guessing at it. And maybe our guesses are good, maybe they're not good. But we're probably going to be guessing at it just due to the nature of the way viruses emerge. And then with flu, we're always guessing at that. Because that's why you get these, you're talking about ranges. Usually the CDC each year will say anywhere from 25,000 to 75,000. So it's like, well, that's sort of a big range under those particular metrics. And then you realize they don't include it usually in cause of death on death certificates. Medical staff are not trained to identify it.
And apparently they throw pneumonia in that number for the regular flu. And I'm thinking, it's just garbage number. There's nothing there that you could make a decision on.
It's in studying flu viruses in the past for other reasons, as soon as a lot of the discussion started coming out, not only comparing the flu, but also talking about COVID, I was like, they're talking about language that doesn't really usually apply in this context. We usually don't do mass testing on the flu. We don't. I mean, there's some people who get it, but it's who do the testing. But usually, by the estimates of the CDC, for every person that they test, they have a confirmed test, they think another 100 people got it. And now it's just based on estimates, based on various studies and surveys, but it's very loose kind of data. It's not the strongest. That's why you get crazy ranges that say, well, maybe the death rate's 0.1, maybe it's 0.3, maybe it's 0.2. I mean, you know, at some point that starts to get a little bit too variable.
So I did a little calculation on the back of my envelope, and I said, if the rest of the country got the same result as New York City, let's say it takes longer because they're not as dense, but there's nothing that at this point that would stop the virus. So if everybody acted, you know, in their normal way, what would happen in terms of the death if we had just the same experience as New York City? It's just multiplied by the rest of the country. And according to my calculations, it's several 100,000 dead. And so it's a pretty big deal. But we don't really know if the rest of the country would go like New York City. And I'll tell you that, speaking of experts that you're not quite sure who to trust, the top virologist in France the other day, I forget his name, Dr. Didier Raoult, maybe, I think, was saying that we don't actually know why any virus peters out. And I'm listening to that, I'm saying, what? It's obvious. Herd immunity, vaccines, of course, that's why they disappear, but apparently not. Apparently we don't, they just disappear, and it's a mystery. And I'm thinking, we've gone this far, you know, putting our whole lives in the hands of experts. One of them tells us that masks don't work. I'm screaming on the internet, you idiot, you're lying. It obviously works. And then this guy tells us after months of dealing with this that we don't even know what makes it go away, and we're going to spend $1 trillion making it go away. We don't know what makes it go away, but apparently it's not vaccines. Apparently it's not herd immunity. We've ruled those out. What's left?
Exactly. I mean, what's fascinating about like the study of, like when I started to look at this and I was thinking, well, when they do these studies, they're going to go through the history of past things, look at past analogies. I'll get some empirical evidence for this. And I was unsettled that it was almost all futuristic projective modeling that says, hey, I'm just going to assume this, and I'll just assume this. And, you know, doing sports betting, doing political betting, it's the great danger of any model. But there'll always be somebody who says, hey, I got an algorithm that magically is going to save you, make you lots of money in the sports betting markets, sometimes in the political betting markets. They're almost never that accurate because their assumptions are poor. And their assumption that the model can, in fact, forecast things that have too many variables in them to predict are also a systematic and systemic flaw in them. But when I studied the viruses, what was fascinating to me, and this is what blew my mind, is one of the other good points of loserthink, was to be very careful of great certainty about long-term future predictions, issues of novelty, issues of complexity, and this virus was screaming that at multiple levels. Because when I study the history of viruses, they do just tend to vanish. And then sometimes, like Spanish flu, they'll all of a sudden come back twice, and then other ones will never come back. 90% of them never come back. And it's like, holy cow.
Apparently we know why the Spanish flu did that, because it was a late season flu. So it had, you know, it was unusual. This one's not like it. So the French guy says, second hump? No, there's not going to be a second wave. That was unique to that one situation. And I'm thinking, really? The experts can't even agree if there's going to be a second wave? Because I was pretty sure that we were certain about that. But apparently not.
Well, exactly. And when I'd reviewed the history of that, and that's what made me concerned. Maybe you could talk about the risk of certainty. That, like, when we come back after the break, we can get into that, and then Scott can ask me a few questions since he's been generous enough to answer all of mine. And we can talk about why when someone tells you they know something with certainty in a case of complexity for long-term future predictions, that's right away when you should start to tune them down in terms of reliance. Come back with us after the break. Welcome back to American Countdown. Well, we're going to go back with Scott Adams here in a few minutes. I do want to, in a minute or so, I do want to thank our sponsor who's been generous enough to make this show possible. to in this extraordinary time, an extraordinary era where, as Scott mentions, we don't know whom often to trust. And some of the people who we're supposed to trust often are not giving us the most reliable information and often not using the most dependable methodology in that time frame. That's why I recommend books like Loser Think, books like How to Win Bigly, or just Win Bigly, and the other one, How to Fail at Almost Everything and Still Win Big. Good books just for your everyday mindset, everyday perspective. You don't have to have a political perspective to have it. All great books to learn and understand and filter and frame the world. But our sponsor is InfoWarsStore.com, where there are a few things that you can get with certainty. You can at least have some storable food, so in case who knows what happens next week. You can get whatever products you like, whether it's fish oil or other things that are good for you. Vitamin D, which they are starting to acknowledge. Vitamin D is good for you. Also means sunshine's probably good for you, but don't tell Governor Newsom in California. And some other things. So go to InfoWarsStore.com, enjoy it, support our sponsor. Great coffee. I get it all the time. They get it from Mexico and other places. I'm a coffee snob, and it's fantastic. So do support our sponsor and help our sponsor to make this show a continuous reality. So let's go back with Scott. We're talking about certainty, that whenever you hear a politician in particular, in my view, but almost anyone, a so-called expert as well, an official expert even, a recognized one, whenever they say something with certainty, particularly when there's complexity, when they're projecting or predicting something that's not in the near-term future, the very methodology of that certainty is itself a warning sign, is itself a risk sign, as identified in Loser Think. I recognize it in cross-examining expert witnesses. When I start to hear or see certainty, I know that, in fact, I have an opening to start to take them apart slowly but surely on the witness stand. And the same thing is true in life. So could you explain, Scott, for me, one of the things that terrified me about a lot of the mayors and county officials and governors doing things that have never been done before was their degree of just certainty. This will absolutely work. This is an absolute risk. And it's like, I always thought one of the great things you said years ago about politics is you don't have great certainty about any particular view because you've disagreed with yourself at different times over time. Now, that was a great way to understand political viewpoints and why we should be aware and particularly cognizant that when certainty is being bandied about, that's times to second guess someone saying it, not times to entrust it.
Yeah, I tell people to keep track of their own errors. Keep something like a diary. Tell people what you're predicting, and then when you're wrong, somebody will remind you. So if you're on social media, a great way to keep yourself humble is to make your predictions public. Because, man, people are going to remind you when you get those wrong. And that tells you how good you are as an expert. But to your point, anybody who doesn't think in terms of odds or percentages is not really part of the intellectual conversation. Everybody else, if you're speaking in certainty about something that nobody should be certain about, it's got too many variables, could go too many different directions. You could make an exception for something really simple. Maybe you can be sure about that. But mostly these are big, complicated decisions. Nobody really knows which is the right way to go. So if I hear somebody say, it's 100%, this is the way to go, doesn't matter which way they say, I just discount it and say, okay, let me talk to somebody who knows what it means to talk in percentages and odds and statistical likelihood. So yeah, don't believe anybody who's certain.
Exactly. And the other thing that my view is to be cognizant and careful of people who don't want you to listen to opposing and differing viewpoints. One of the points you point out in Loser Think is that by itself, someone that you may be in a cult-like mindset if they're making predictions about far future things and telling you you can't listen to anyone else. If you listen to anyone else, that by itself is a warning sign. And that's my response. Like when I see everybody agreeing, I automatically get a little bit worried. I would rather have a few dissident voices in the room, and I would have more confidence in the opinion if I thought, okay, this is like Trump, I think, does a brilliant job of this. He likes multiple voices in the room because he has confidence in the conflict of ideas, him coming to some confluence of a policy decision. Whereas if he has everybody saying the same thing, and it's one of the things that's worried me throughout this whole pandemic, too many of the public health officials all had the same motivation. Nobody wanted to be the dissident. Nobody wanted to be the outlier. Nobody wanted to say, well, like the French guy. Nobody would say, well, actually, we don't really know that. Nobody wanted to say that until late in the ball game when they're starting to, things are going a different direction. So could you talk about, Christopher Lasch always described it, we expose our ideas to the people who have the greatest incentive to attack them because it helps improve our own understanding of the ideas. We may not convert our change our opinions. Maybe sometimes we do, but often it makes us say, like I find whenever I want to research something, it's because somebody told me something that I disagreed with. And I was like, no, that can't be right. And I'd go, and sometimes I'd find out I was wrong and they were right. Sometimes I'd find out more information that would explain why what they thought was true was not necessarily true. So can you talk about the importance of that methodology?
Well, I have a method that I learned when I was writing scripts for Hollywood, when I was doing a Dilbert TV show years ago. And it was the idea of putting out the bad idea that you know is imperfect, and then other people will fix it. So I'm a big fan of embarrassing myself in public, saying, you know, I haven't thought this through, but would this work? And then you just see what people say. Sometimes I put it out with a little more confidence, and people come back and say, you read the data wrong, idiot. And I go, oh, okay, I'll change my mind. So it's good to be flexible and humble, but also I like to see all, let's say, all understanding. I like to see as a process that never ends. Now, you and I'm just going to predict that this is true. I believe that you and I have a similar experience in this one regard, that you're close enough to politics and people that you've seen the real story, and then you've seen how it was written in the press, and they're almost never the same. And once you get a peek behind the curtain, and you say, okay, that's the real story. How'd they write it? Not even close. Wait a minute. Behind the curtain? Am I sure? Yep, not even close. And of course, when you're the subject of stories, as I have been countless times, then I can see all the errors, more clearly. But the public reads the news and says, well, it's experts, and the press people talk to the experts. Why wouldn't I believe this? But it's pretty well established that the experts would look at almost any article and say, I wouldn't have said it that way. And I also like to remind people, I don't think there's an exception to this, but you could take every complicated decision, scientific, political, etc., and there will be brilliant people on all sides every time. So if intelligence and being well informed helped you make decisions, you would expect really almost everybody would be on the same side with stuff, but it just doesn't work that way. Intelligence and even experience can put you on completely opposite sides. So we're kind of on our own to figure out which experts we believe in. And I take a combination of track record and look at the context and see if there's anything I can decide on my own, such as I think masks do work. There's some things that you don't need to be the expert to decide on.
Well, I think in that way where people fall on their common sense, which is sort of a lifetime of experience, its own form of learned education, and it can be a critical counterbalance to expert opinion, particularly where expert opinion can be disconnected from an everyday reality that other people have experienced. So in like case of mask, you see mass use of it by people that have experienced particularly bigger outbreaks like SARS in Asia, throughout Asia, Singapore, Hong Kong. Almost everyone's using it, and then somehow it became as something you couldn't use here in the States, which made no sense. But now, of course, it's becoming mandatory, which I also find too. I find it's like we're either on one side too far, or all of a sudden the people think the solution is, let's go completely the opposite too far. It's like there's a balance between those two, maybe, that where we don't have to go nuts. We don't have to deprive people of individual consent to be able to achieve good public health policy consequences. But so we'll see how that goes. I think one of the other great filters that you talk about in Loserthink and in other books and other texts and have lived it is what you were talking about, which is a near short-term predictive filter. Like I think you described that you're probably in a cult if somebody can't even get, or you're probably doing Loserthink if you continuously can't predict the near short-term future correctly, but are absolutely certain at the same time that you're going to be correct. This would be a telltale indicator, in my view, of Trump derangement syndrome, is somebody says Trump is going to do this in the next 10 days, and he does just the opposite of what they said.
But the only flaw with that is if you're tracking your successes and your failures. I would look at the Trump administration, let's say prior to coronavirus, and I would say, whether you liked him or didn't, you'd have to say he made X promises. He's done a pretty darn good job at delivering promises. The ones that aren't fully delivered, you can see he's working as hard as he can, like border security, et cetera. But another person will look at it and say, well, I told you this would happen if he got elected. Look at everything that's gone wrong. The country is divided. And I'll be like, I don't know, more than usual. It doesn't seem to affect me when I go buy groceries. You know, I'm not seeing that. So people are imagining that they're living in this hellscape. And I'm living in exactly the same world. And I'm thinking, you know, at least until the coronavirus, looked pretty good to me. It sounds like things are kind of working here. So I don't know what world you're looking at. So even you can't even keep track after the fact. And in fact, when this coronavirus thing is all said and done, we will never agree what was the right thing to do, whether we did it or whether we should have done something else. It is unsolvable, and we will argue it forever.
Yeah, that's probably true. And it's the nature of alternatives you can't live out. You know, you can't live out the alternative universe. You can only sort of guess at it. You can speculate at it. You can have evidence of a kind of evidence, but it's evidence that's by its inherent nature speculative because you didn't live it. You know, you didn't take that other train. You didn't take that other road.
Yeah, the simple example of that is I say, if somebody says, is your president, doesn't matter which president, is your president doing a good job or a bad job? The dumb people will say yes, and the dumb people will say no. The smart people will say, compared to what?
Right.
Because it's only a comparison problem. Where was the other president doing the same job in the same situation during the same time? Didn't have one. You couldn't have one. So you can never really know if the imaginary perfect president in your mind would have done the better job. So I usually default to this, and I say, I don't believe there's such a thing as good presidents and bad. I believe that there are presidents who are suited to certain tasks, and it might be a different president for each task. For example, if I want somebody to negotiate tough with China, I want a Trump. If I've got a coronavirus and I just need somebody to cry with the country, maybe not Trump, right? So he's optimized for certain kinds of tasks, and if that's the thing the country needs, well, you're in luck. But if the situation changes, you're like, let's just see if we can get by this. And then, you know, the next phase Trump promises is an amazing comeback. Now, who would you rather have in charge if the next phase is we have to try as hard as we can to have an amazing economic comeback? I'm sorry, there's nobody on the planet that would be better than Trump for that. But if there's another tragedy and you need to see him cry, just not the right guy. He's not the right guy for that.
Exactly. I thought for political purposes, the quicker he could get this off of pandemic, and into a comeback story, and maybe particularly a comeback story that involves bringing back jobs and decoupling from China, which really was our greatest national security risk. It was some of his, you know, to do the pun, trump card has been that all the things he warned about China in terms of overdependence on supply chains in China, national security implications of China, lost wages and jobs connected to China. China went from 3% of world manufacturing to 22% in 20 years because they bought off a lot of U.S. politicians. Well, we saw the middle of America get just gutted. And now we have, in my view, the perfect opportunity and the perfect reason to completely decouple, aside from them dumping fentanyl and doing business with Mexican drug cartels, aside from all of the other issues, they're going to send us viruses every couple of years. So maybe it's time to really shut down the supply chains, bring jobs back here.
You know, whenever we have some big emergency or a world war or something, you know, you're of course, as you should, focused on the tragedy and the problems. But when you're done, it's very common that suddenly it's like, oh, we've got a space program now. We've got nuclear power now because you've invented, and you know, because necessity causes you to invent faster than you normally would. So there's a non-zero chance that what we're seeing is what I like to call the third act in movie script writing terms. About, you know, toward the end, there's something called the third act, where the hero is in such trouble that you can't even imagine how this problem could be solved, and then it gets solved. So the coronavirus, it feels like Trump's third act. Like this just crushed everything that was good about the Trump economy, his primary calling card. And how does he get this back? It doesn't look possible, especially with this election coming up, right? There's not much time to get something going before that election day. So it's sort of this perfect setup. But let me give you the optimist view. Like you said, this might be the only thing that would have ever gotten us to decouple from China. If that's true, and I think it is, the gains will far outpace the cost of the coronavirus. Even at trillions, the gains will be far greater than that. Then you add in, for example, the scientific or medical gains of putting so much attention on viruses. It's possible we won't have another pandemic, because we might actually get to the point where we say, we just figured out how to make a vaccine in 30 days, and we can run it through the supercomputer and we don't need to test it on humans. I'm just making that up. I don't think that's a thing. But you can imagine that the scientific concentration creates such lasting, enormous, we could have a vaccine for the common cold. We may have given up handshaking, which would, save 100,000 lives a year just because you didn't shake hands and catch whatever the hell they had. So I think we may be approaching a golden age in which we learn how much not to trust our experts. Very important, because that's like, if this were a video game, I feel that we just leveled up. Like the entire humanity just went from, of course experts are right, to, oh my God, I always thought they were right, and I just watched them be as wrong as you could possibly be wrong across a whole range of things, one right after another. I no longer question whether they could be totally wrong. And then what does that do for your climate change? What does it do for everything? It just changes how you think. So I think we might be on the cusp of a golden age, and humanity has a way. We do have a way of turning these situations into gold, and Americans especially. Americans have ways to make profits off of just any damn thing. Like it's what we do better than anything. So people are going to figure out how to turn a profit on this as well.
So basically, if Trump is sort of like Rocky, it looks bad early, it's looking bad in the middle rounds. He's got only a round or two left, and really it's to the 12th round. But he's just like Rocky. There's nobody you would want more in that 12th round to give you the shot at the knockout comeback of the ultimate comeback.
Yeah, that's right. And in the first election in 2016, you could say that the third act was when the Access Hollywood tape dropped. And I was, I'd been predicting he'd win from the start. And I got to tell you, that week, I lost my confidence. I lost it that week. Now, I got it back before Election Day, came back. But if you had told me that any candidate could get past that, I don't know if I would have guessed that.
Oh, yeah. I was over in Dublin and London at the time trying to place bets on him everywhere I could. But all of my friends were telling me I was totally insane after that Access Hollywood tape dropped. And I had my theories, I had my interpretation as to why I didn't think it'd be consequential, in part because Trump is Trump. But he definitely lost votes. I think he lost the quote unquote popular vote would have gone for Trump, but for that. I think he had maybe a padded lead of types. I think he was up by one or two, but he was still up just enough to hold on in the key swing states and win big.
I got to say, I've never met anybody who said they changed their vote because of that. Because I think for his supporters, that was pretty baked in. He's the only politician who ever said in these exact words, "I'm no angel." And I thought it was just a throwaway line in some interview during the campaign. And I thought, well, okay, now that you've said that, if something comes out, because you knew there would be, right, that proves you're no angel, I'm going to look back at that and say, well, you did warn us. You warned us. What were we expecting? So I think people said, okay, this is on me. Like, this isn't just on him. He told us, and we still chose him. This is sort of on us. We'll take ours. We'll get our Supreme Court nominees, but let's accept a little bit is on us.
No doubt. Do you have any questions for me, since you've been generous enough to answer all of mine?
Have you changed your opinion at all on the dangerousness of the coronavirus?
It's still mostly the same. My initial prediction was it would be somewhere around twice, 3 times the Asian flu, Hong Kong flu, a severe flu. So now that's operating within the parameters that, as you note, there's a lot of doubts about what those parameters are. But so basically I was assuming somewhere around between 100, 200,000 deaths, something that would increase our more fatalities, that when we do it by the year's end, somewhere around 5 to 10%. I'm still mostly in that range. So now I am more concerned about whether we may get a spike in deaths due to two things. I still don't understand what our nursing home provisions are. I haven't understood them from the get-go. And I keep seeing, and there doesn't seem to be any fixing them. I'm getting people now that are nurses at those nursing homes texting or emailing and messaging me about problems that are happening, that they brought warning signs. They're getting fired if they're whistleblowers. By the way, there's talk there. They're trying to, the smart ones are treating them with hydrochlorine. But they're supposed to keep that quiet, not supposed to let anyone know about it, even though it appears it may actually reduce the number of deaths in nursing homes. So that has me concerned that we may have more deaths there than I think would have had to have been the case. And then I would say my other concern in that area is I didn't expect the degree of hospital. I was a critic of this degree of shutdown because I thought there would be collateral consequences they had not priced in to the equation effectively. They hadn't, you call it allocating the risks effectively. I thought they'd failed to allocate those risks. It was a sign of loser think in my view. But I did not think that the hospital capacity collapse outside of the epicenters where they did getting rid of elective care, I think was a bad idea. I'm getting people who want to bring wrongful death suits because parent didn't, someone got appendicitis, didn't go in until 2 days later. Now, some of this may have been unintended, but it was foreseeable. I think if our public policy officials would have thought through, okay, what's all the cost of whether I do this policy?
Well, I've been trying to take the position on everything about the coronavirus that I'm not going to judge anybody's mistakes. Doesn't matter what party they are, what job they are, if expert or politician. I am not going to judge them by their mistakes because everybody is operating with no data. I mean, all the data is questionable. So of course, but I am going to judge them by how quickly they fix an obvious mistake. And you can see, adjustments have happened all along. And I say, okay, good adjustment. Don't have ventilators? Make some. Good adjustment. Don't have enough PPE? Adjust. Did you adjust properly? We have enough. Good. But then you watch things like not allowing people out on the beach. And I'm thinking, that was an easy adjustment. All right. I would have had no problem with making the original mistake of saying you can't go to the beach or the beach is closed. But the fact that you don't fix that after a while, I mean, anything that's so easily fixable, the nursing homes is another situation. I'm thinking, I don't know how many tests we have, but we must have enough of the 5-minute tests that you could just surround these nursing homes and nobody gets in or out without a test, that you have a result in 5 minutes. I mean, isn't that fixable? And if it's not fixable, where are our experts saying, look, we've got to get this around, we've got to surround these nursing homes with bulletproof tests? We're halfway there. Give us another month. Where's that, right? So I've said from the start that if you're not measuring, this is a management truism, if you're not measuring the effects of what you're doing and then adjusting, of course, you're not managing. So if you say to somebody, what are your stats? How close are you? And they say, well, we made 1,000 ventilators. I go, well, that wasn't what I asked. Of the ones that you need, are you halfway there, 90% there? And then Mike Pence will say, and we made 500 other ventilators. No, you're just naming numbers of ventilators. You're not measuring what has to be done and how you are to it. And therefore, you're not managing it. And if you're not managing it, what result should we expect? Random.
Well, exactly. A large part of this that was concerning to me was a lack of consistently objective metrics we could measure things. I didn't see public policy, even at least I was like, even if you're not even doing it internally, at least pretend you're doing it for persuasive purposes. But there was a lack of confidence installation by their course of behavior. And things like the nursing homes, when I found out they had ordered the nursing homes to take people who had COVID. And I was like, well, my confidence level in government has not gone up during this pandemic response.
Yeah. But even then, they did adjust that, right? So they changed that. So and so again, I'm going to try to be consistent. It looks to me like a terrible decision to put them in there in the first place. Who knows what variables they were working with? They adjusted. That's good. That's all I'm going to ask from anybody.
Right. Any other questions?
Do you have any bets about this upcoming election?
This has been a total red herring. So my traditional old school metrics from the time I was a kid was a very simple basic, which was whether or not, hey, the cat's interested. The maybe a secret UK gambler. The basically was if the incumbent party did not face meaningful opposition, then the incumbent party, at least in American history, tended to win at a very high rate. And then once you dug into why, you could start to figure out the logic behind it, and to where people had sort of really made up their mind a year in advance. They just didn't know they had made up their mind a year in advance. And at least everything so far was looking perfect for Trump. No meaningful incumbent opposition. And when the incumbent party doesn't have meaningful opposition, the party in opposition obsesses more with voting for an electable person than they do voting for the person they like the most as a future president, in which case they always pick the worst possible person. Though I will say that in that that's how you get Mondale 1984, Bob Dole 1996, John Kerry 2004, Mitt Romney 2012. All the people that when the voters looked at it, they said, that guy reminds me the most of a politician. Not, that's the guy I want to be in the Oval Office when the proverbial SH hits the fan. But in that context, Joe Biden is clearly the weakest possible candidate I have ever witnessed. And what I've been telling people is, if you're going to bet against Trump, don't bet on Biden. Bet on somebody else getting nominated at the last minute, of them subbing him out. Because Biden, as long as the alternative, as you put it, you're compared to what? As long as it's compared to Biden, I think Trump, he could shoot someone on Park Avenue and get reelected. Because I think the fear factor with that guy is off the charts in terms of his mental capacity and other issues. So that's where I'm mostly at. If they replace him, I worry about Trump. If they don't, I don't.
Now, do you think the replacement, I think most people think there's going to be a replacement. I mean, even Biden talks like there is. Do you think they'll use the vice president as let's get him past the election, or even flip the ticket before the election day? Or do you think that they'll do just brute force where we just have to replace you, Joe? Can you just say that you've got a health problem and we'll take care of this?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I have friends of mine in Vegas that are putting all different bets. They liked Cuomo early because Cuomo was getting so much attention connected to the pandemic. I don't. Cuomo himself has said he's not going to run. If I was
he can't run because he would give up all of his goodwill, because the thing that makes him popular is he's all hands on, focus on this problem. The minute he said, I'm also running for president, bam, gone.
Exactly. If I were them, I would pick someone like the Montana governor. Some small town, small state, red state kind of governor, someone like a Clinton, someone like a Carter, at least by demographic profile, doesn't have much baggage. People would say, oh, that's a get something done guy and doesn't scare me. Not Governor Newsom from California, not Cuomo from New York. So, but I think the odds are about 25% they replace him. But thanks, Scott, for joining us. So my current bet is still with Trump, but I'm on hedge until I see whether he can do the rocky comeback you talk about. Thanks for being with us, Scott.
Okay. All right, thank you.